That is not what an introvert looks like. But sadly, it's what society would have us believe introverts look like. The awkward fumbling around, stopping between sentences, inability to finish words. But these are introverted behaviors, and that's why I'm here today. Basically, the only difference between introverts and extroverts is a matter of energy. A lot of people would have you believe that it's to do with how you act in public, that an extrovert will be that really buzzy person who goes around and talks to everybody, is really full of energy constantly. And then an introvert is somebody who locks themselves away in their room and doesn't talk to anybody, really. That's a lie. Let's take a situation like a party. You've got person A, who's an extrovert. They'll walk up, join their friends, and start having a conversation, and it's quite interesting. And over the next few hours, it'll slowly die down and dissolve. Person B is the exact same person as person A, except they're not an extrovert, they're an introvert. So when they join the conversation, they act the same way, they say the same things, and basically there's no difference. Except for the fact that they are much more likely to leave after 30 minutes or an hour instead of waiting for the conversation itself to die down. An extrovert will get their energy from the group. They'll have a conversation and they'll get energy from that act. But an introvert will get their energy from reading a book or sitting down with a cup of tea, basically not being in a social situation. That's the only difference. So why is it so confusing to a lot of people that, why do some people think that it's to do with how you talk and how you act around other people? Well, it's when you bring into account social anxiety. Social anxiety, whether it's shyness or full-out social phobia, is something that a lot of people have to deal with. Everybody, including introverts and extroverts. There is no link between being an introvert and being socially anxious. In the same situation where you've got people standing around and talking to each other, the socially anxious person would feel afraid to join that conversation. And when they did, then they'd begin to feel uncomfortable, and it would be quite difficult to stay in that conversation for a long period of time. And depending on how severe your social anxiety is, you might have difficulty with talking to even closest friends. Society tends to act very differently and distinguish between introverts and extroverts and social anxiety on many different ways. For example, in the education world. More and more nowadays, then we're moving towards group work in the Western world. Not necessarily in the IB. The IB is pretty good at balancing out 2/3 extrovert group work and 1/3 introvert singular work. But in the rest of the world, or at least in the rest of the West, then it's moving more towards groups. You sit around no longer in these neat lines all facing the teacher at the front, but instead in these bizarre hexagonal tables where you have to talk to other people consistently. And obviously, this becomes more difficult for an introvert than an extrovert, because an introvert will be more happy to just be sitting there writing or taking notes than having to have a discussion with other people. And for some people, social anxiety is especially difficult. Of course, there are a lot of projects where it makes sense to be in a group. I mean, if you're doing a science project and your partner's hair catches fire, you kind of need to be there to throw the bucket of water over their head. But there are some projects where it just doesn't make sense. I mean, I've had to write creative short stories in groups, which just ends up with people arguing over what this character would do and saying that they know the main character better than anyone else, which is absurd. And then you move into the workplace. Well, it doesn't really go away, that distinguishing factor between group work and individual work. It just changes its name into being networking, which is a fancy way of saying talking to people and not wanting to punch their face in. An extrovert will feel a lot more comfortable doing this after a long day of work, but an introvert will still be able to do it, they'll just get slightly tetchy after a while. And of course I don't need to say that the socially anxious person will find this especially difficult again. When I was preparing for this speech, I remembered that I'd had a bizarre moment about 6 months ago now, maybe a bit more, where I was being interviewed, yes, a bit more, a year. I was being interviewed for this school, and it's the only major interview I've had in my life. Hopefully not the last. So, I'm at this interview, and I haven't prepared for it for many different reasons. And they're asking all those typical questions, what do you enjoy doing? What are your hobbies? What are you going to bring to the school? Why do you want to come here? What are your strengths? And most importantly, what is your biggest weakness? Now, at the time I didn't know this, but apparently you're meant to answer this with a fake weakness. Like, oh, I put too much work into my projects, so I'm willing to sacrifice my social life and my sleep patterns for my studies. Stupid weaknesses like that. But I was naive, and I thought you were actually meant to answer with a proper, thing that you didn't like about yourself. So I sat there for a bit and thought, and then said the first thing that came to my mind, which was, I'm an introvert. Now this was wrong for several reasons, because firstly, it's not really a negative. Being an introvert isn't a bad thing, it just means you get your energy from elsewhere. But the main thing that was wrong with it was the fact that I'm not really an introvert. I've tried to kid myself for quite a long time now that I am an introvert. Because as far back as I can remember, I've been anxious around social situations. When I was little, then everybody would always say, oh, she's shy, she'll grow out of it. And then all my school reports kept coming in, and they would say, she seems to really understand the topic, but she just needs to talk more. She needs to speak up in class. She seems to get what's going on, but she doesn't contribute in the same way that she's meant to. Around my closest friends, people I'd known for 10 years or more, I just still couldn't get comfortable. I'm still uncomfortable in this school around my current friends. And it was very difficult for me because I was told by a lot of people that this behavior was being an introvert. I never had anybody tell me that I was socially anxious. They just said, it's fine, you're an introvert. And while that may be a nice thing to say to somebody to try and make it easier on them, it doesn't make it easier. Because I know that being an introvert is something that you can't change. You can't change whether you're an introvert or you're an extrovert just by thinking about it. You can't change it by going through therapy. And so when somebody told me that this fear and this anxiety and this loneliness that I was having was something that I couldn't change no matter how hard I tried, that destroyed me. And it took me ages to work out that I could actually fix it. This was something that I could work on and that I could eventually get around. And that I wouldn't always be the kind of bumbling idiot and the persona that I was playing at the beginning of this speech. That I could get past this. And because people kept trying to fit me into these boxes, this absurd binary of introvert and extrovert, which really doesn't exist in the end, and then attaching the fact that social anxiety only occurs to introverts, to that, just made it so much more difficult for me. Because we don't exist in a binary. Very few things in life exist on a binary. Most things are a wonderful gradient. And a lot of people, a lot of psychologists believe that if you ever found yourself fully introvert or fully extrovert, you'd probably have to go to a lunatic asylum. Because nobody can live like that. You can't live having to get your energy from only talking to people. You can't live by just locking yourself away and constantly being alone. You have to be around people and you have to have alone time. That's why a lot of people sometimes feel as if they just want to leave a conversation after 30 minutes, but other days will think, oh, I can come through this. A lot of people might think this isn't a particularly important issue. I could have very easily stood up here and talked about the 2,000 dead in Nigeria because of Boko Haram. I could have talked about the Charlie Hebdo shootings. I could have talked about the sheer number of transgender youth who have committed suicide since the beginning of the year. I could have talked on a more personal level about what it's like growing up as an immigrant child in a country where the policies are beginning to look more and more anti-immigrant every day. But I didn't. Because this, even though it doesn't seem like it's that important in a lot of day-to-day life, does cause problems all the time. People misdiagnose their social anxiety and just say that they're introverts all the time. 2/3 of people with social anxiety are extroverts, but they're all just going to assume that they're introverts because of it. And because of that, then they're always just going to say, that it's fine, that they don't need help, and they're going to push away those who could help them in those situations. And while it may not be something that people talk about a lot, it deserves to be talked about. It's such a simple issue. All that people need to do is understand that people with social anxiety aren't necessarily introverts, and people who are really good at having conversations aren't necessarily extroverts. And by doing that, you give a whole section of humanity a voice. Because I'm many things, but I'm not an introvert. I'm not an extrovert either. I'm afraid, and I'm terrified in most of my life. And talking to people really, really freaks me out. And I'm alone a lot of my time. But the one thing that I'm not anymore is ashamed.